last but really by no means least, it's a great privilege to introduce to you Sir Brian Heap, who is Vice President of the European Academy's Science Advisory Council. He is, well, I won't go through all this biography because you've got it in front of you, but an immensely distinguished scientific career. He was a former master of this college, and he's been Vice President of the Royal Society and Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society, and held many other posts, many advisory posts in Europe and in the UK. So it's a tremendous privilege, Brian, to have you speak to us.
Thank you very much, Rodney. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I want to divide it into three parts. First of all, I'd like to talk about is food insecurity a serious issue? Secondly, to look at the question, can genetics help? And thirdly, is there a moral imperative? But I'd like to start by referring to, if I can get it to work, it's frozen, which I just want to check the system. Working beautifully before lunch, of course.
Where's Zoe?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
I go and locate Zoe.
Just again. See what it is.
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
It started working up.
That's fine.
Is it okay?
Yeah. Let's come back to life, I think, just about it. Yeah. So, I want to start by referring to Sir John Templeton, whose foundation funds this program and, of course, funds the Faraday Institute. And he was particularly interested in big questions, and he was a pioneer in financial investment and philanthropy. And he spent a lifetime encouraging open-mindedness. In 1999, the Money magazine called him arguably the greatest global stock picker of the century. The Economist said that he was revered for thrift and had a horror of debt. And his white-columned house in the Bahamas overlooking the golf course, he still cut up computer paper to make notebooks. And when he died, Nature said, he was a deeply spiritual, although unorthodox individual. He lived a life firmly rooted in the Christian traditions of modesty and charity, yet he was also a great admirer of science, which led him to form his foundation in 1987. And just recently, the foundation has decided to fund work in the field of genetics. And some of the first grants examine how the biosciences can help smallholder farmers in African countries. And we have one of those, looking at socio-economic impact and the impediments to the adoption of new knowledge. So the introduction of this course into the Faraday syllabus, I think is very timely because it resonates with Sir John's interests in humanitarian challenges of hunger and poverty, and how advances in science and technology can be brought to bear on this issue. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with the fact that we face increasing demand for the world's finite resources, and the question that we're looking at this afternoon, will our expanding knowledge of biosciences and genetics in particular enable us to enjoy and share the benefits of science? Or will it be used for good or ill, or will it be for the relief of man's estate or its devastation? Is it playing God? Joe Perry was a scientist at Rothenstein Research Institute in Harpenden who phrased it in the following way for people with a faith position and who are engaged in the debate. Are the processes used in molecular plant breeding explicitly forbidden in the sacred texts? Is the whole concept tainted through unwarranted usurping of the Creator's function in having created life? do the products of plant breeding have consequences that are outside God's will? I want to try to touch on some of those questions that Joe Perry raised. Now, food security, as you can see from this particular slide, with the increase in population, developing countries and developed countries shown here, and the population impact going up to something of the order of 9 billion by 2050, and FAO suggesting that food production must increase by 70% if we're to feed the world population. So this slide illustrates that particular point. Here's the projected population growth gradually decreasing on a per annum basis, but here's the average calorie availability, and here's the overlap that is causing a great concern. So if we would continue to produce food on the present rate, it would follow this sort of line, but the requirement is going to be of that order in terms of future needs. And it's reminiscent of the essay of Malthus, which there's a modern copy on the table here if you're not already familiar with it, on his great essay on the principle of population. And it was Malthus, of course, who drew attention to the idea that, and his name became a household word, that a stage would soon be reached where there was not sufficient food to feed the people of the world. And of course his essay became a classic because, as the cynic says, the classics are like the aristocracy. We learn their titles and thereafter claim acquaintance with them. And so the question is how many people have actually read the essay, which is of great interest to us, of course. Let me show briefly why it is that there is particular concern about whether we're going to be able to meet this world demand for food. And this slide, I think, raises a telling point. So here's the increase in wheat yield in the UK. The national average has increased enormously from something like 2.8 tonnes per hectare to 8 tonnes per hectare now. Here's the use of fertilizer, which has plateaued. And John Bingham, who is one of the distinguished plant breeders who actually lives here in Cambridge and worked here, says there is no prospect of a stepwise increase in yield equating to a second green revolution unless the physiology of the crop can be radically altered. And so there's a concern that crop yields are reaching a plateau in many crops, not just wheat, but this seems to apply to others as well. There's also a concern that climate change has started to suppress food production around the world during the past 3 decades. Global maize production, global corn production, those of you familiar with the US description, is estimated to be 3.8% lower than it would have been if the Earth had not started to warm. And so overall, the changes that are brought by warming climate during the last few decades has bumped up commodity prices by about 6.4% is the estimate. That's one concern. Another concern is here with the average cereal yields from a period of about 1960 through to the present time. And you can see in terms of tons per hectare how this has increased enormously in China and South Asia, but virtually nothing in sub-Saharan Africa. And this reminds us of the regional differences that are faced so far as the global situation is concerned. Africa as a continent is lagging far behind. And of course the problem with this in terms of food insecurity is the impact it has on price. And here you see data that's taken from the regular annual FAO analysis of the food price index, the commodity price index. You take a basket of components of of food, sugar, oils, fats, cereals, dairy and meat, and from this the formula is worked out that then leads to the food index, which is shown here. And here's an example of the way in which the food indexes has been so volatile during the past 8 years, and here at 2008 and 2011. And these hatched areas here indicate the time when there were riots in the streets. So food spikes are a problem in terms of people's, in terms of social insecurity and social disintegration and social unrest. Now these crises pushed about 100 million people into hunger. It was the result of food shortage, but it was also the result of market volatility and speculation and a whole range of other things. So it's a very complex story. But the countries that remain most at risk, where the food makes up a large proportion of overall spending, are first of all China, 40%, the Philippines, 43%, Indonesia, 45%, Pakistan, 48%, India and Vietnam, 50%, and Congo, 70%. So we can see a sensitivity to food insecurity. So as a result of this, we find at the present time that 1 in 6 of the world's population is hungry, and we have to increase food production by a significant figure by 2050. This lack of the capability to obtain food or to pay for it is what Amartya Sen calls the deprivation of capabilities. Now, religions worldwide promote hunger relief. Probably one of the things that we really do all agree on. And historically, we know of the situation in the land of Israel, the cornucopia of milk and honey. In Christianity, Paul writes about the importance of feeding people and dealing with those who are thirsty. Islam speaks about who would deny the recompense. Well, that is the one who drives away the orphan and doesn't encourage the feeding of the poor, and so one can go on. Buddhism and so on and so forth. But the question that is often raised, well, surely there is enough food in the world to feed everybody. It's all a question of distribution. Well, yes, that's true. But sadly, food redistribution is not the answer for several reasons. First of all, it's prohibitively expensive to ship food, large quantities of food around the world, and the environmental costs are very significant also. But the other key point is that much of the food that is available in excess is not the type of food that is required in places where there's greatest hunger. So it's often unsuited to the diets of those who live in less developed countries. So it soon becomes clear when we start to think about food insecurity that there are no simple quick fixes to this problem. And so let's just look at how agriculture has historically risen to the challenge. And I think this is quite an interesting analysis, much of which is taken from Noel Kingsbury's book, Hybrid, which is in the bookstalls, an excellent book on the history associated with food production and food security. So here are wheat yields over the last century. Here's what happened to maize, to corn, when hybrids were introduced. Fertilizer use started, herbicide use, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, and here, the adoption of plant biotechnology. So you can see these are climbing up with the introduction of a range of what is referred to here as new technology. So this is one approach, the possibility of using technology to address the problem. And today, modern plant breeding has become more laboratory and industry-based, and plant breeders are now a rather different group than they were a century ago. But in future, what is very clear, and it's emphasized in a report from the Royal Society that was published a couple of years ago called Reaping the Benefits, what is very clear is there is very little extra land available to grow this food. And so we're going to have to look at ways in which the food can be grown more intensively and more effectively on the land which we have currently available. Now, what about these technologies? And And I want to spend a little time just going through and rehearsing a few of these, because some of these are technologies where genetics impinges very directly on the way the technology is developed. Not for one moment, let me emphasize at this stage, saying that it is all to do with technology. But since we're looking at God and genetics, I want to focus on genetics in terms of what technological advances might derive from the application of genetics. So, appropriate technologies, traditional and intermediate. Here's an example of a home garden in Java, which presents us with an interesting example of the extraordinary diversity of genetics in the crops around a small farmer's home. And it provides a sustainable livelihood. There's about 250,000 higher plant species, of which 3,000 are known to be edible. 150 have become important crops, but only 15 plant species supply more than 90% of our food. So that although there's a huge diversity, we are so dependent on an extraordinarily small number to provide us with the food that we eat. Water's clearly a priority, and I put this one here to illustrate the work of Kickstart, a guy, an entrepreneur in Nairobi, who's developed a very interesting method for bringing water out from subterranean water at a low-cost, human-powered irrigation pump. And this has brought about 667,000 people out of poverty in Kenya. Simple technology, operated by a husband and wife, 2 people. And here's the other one, which is drip irrigation, which is the provision of water directly to plants. So traditional and intermediate technologies play their part if the increase in food production is going to be met. Another way is what I'm calling here conventional but more precise plant breeding. And this is to control witchweed, which is a parasite that attacks the maize plant, attacks the maize roots and causes devastation, particularly in East Africa. It's found over 2.4 million hectares, huge loss. And now there has been, through plant breeding, a strain of maize developed which is resistant to this herbicide, imazapyr. So what happens is that when the seed is prepared, it's coated with this herbicide, and when it germinates, the strider weed also germinates at the same time and is killed by this herbicide, which does not affect the plant itself. This is something that was discovered by one of the plant breeding companies, BASF, made available to CIMMYT, the International Maize Center, which has then developed it for commercial use and for the availability of small farmers. So here's an example of conventional plant breeding being used in a more precise way to protect the crop against devastation from parasitic weed. Here's another example that has been developed in Rothenstedt, not far from here, which is called the push-pull intercropping. This makes use of the idea that there are natural chemicals that come from grass which pulls the moths to lay eggs. It attracts the moths to lay eggs on the grass. This draws them away from the maize plant so that it's no longer affected in the same way. Alternatively, you can plant this species here, which is Desmodium, which you can plant between the rows of maize, and in a similar way, natural chemicals from Desmodium repels the moths and it pushes them away from the maize plant, so that the maize plant survives much more successfully. This is a novel cropping system, and it's now being developed by about 50,000 smallholders in East Africa, and it's another technique using minimal inputs. This is actually using and selecting quality seed but it's not requiring any particular input, any herbicide or any pesticide. It's actually using the genetics of the plant in order to bring about these effects. So conventional plant breeding, which is really what I'm talking about, is still important. I'm going to move on, as you can see in a moment, to GM. But let's not forget how important conventional plant breeding is. Just going back to the Malthus essay, where Malthus felt that there was a grave danger that we would be unable to feed the world population, unable to keep up with that. What he didn't realise, of course, and what he couldn't realise, is the brilliant skill of plant breeders and geneticists who have selected and bred plants which have produced much higher yield, much greater protection in some cases against certain diseases, and that has all been through conventional plant breeding. So conventional plant breeding entails sexual hybridization followed by careful selection. Breeders over centuries have travelled long distances to find desirable traits. Now, some of these arise by spontaneous mutation, and others can be produced by chemical or radiation stimulation. And this can lead to pure line breeding, or what is called hybrid breeding. What today is now called, I'm going to move on to that in a moment, molecular plant breeding. So plant breeders now use the new molecular biology that is available from studies of the genomes, and particularly plant genomes, of course, and they use what is called marker-assisted selection, MAS. And these molecular markers are short strings of nucleic acid which make up a segment of DNA. They are found near a DNA sequence of a desired gene which you want to select for, and in this way, using very sophisticated techniques in the laboratory and high throughput screening and all those things, it then becomes possible to do selection by what is called genetic linkage, and to do this much more effectively than you could in the past. Now, some people would then go on to say, and much faster. And I want to show you in a little later that there's a big question mark as to whether it's any faster. It's more precise, but is it any faster? So that's, I started to look at the question of food insecurity as a serious issue. Can genetics help? Genetics has been helping over decades, over hundreds of years. There's no question about that. But the question that we now move on to is whether what we might call the new genetics, that is plant biotechnology, whether that is going to help or not. We could summarize it, I think, in this way. Plant breeding and biotechnology by building productivity and sustainability into the seed. So the crucial thing that we're going on to now is the seed itself. Can scientists increase the ability of the plants to have a better nutrient uptake efficiency, improve their nutritive value, increase drought tolerance, increase water use efficacy, counter new pests and disease outbreaks? Now, to do that can take up to 10 to 20 years to commercialize a crop, and as we'll see later, it costs about £100 million to do. So what are the steps involved in genetic modification? Here we come to the core of our topic for this afternoon. So you need, first of all, to identify the gene, an interesting gene, let's say drought resistance. You need to isolate it, insert it into a genetic instruction, multiply it, transfer it, and transform the cells. And then you may go through that cycle many times, and then you regenerate the plant, you evaluate whether the gene is expressed. You then start to add crosses, you make crosses to other varieties until you have the gene that you require selected in a particular quality line. And there's all sorts of techniques coming along which develop on this idea. So here's a method that actually allows you to shoot the gene of interest into the plant. So here we're coming to the situation where we're now talking about modifying the genetics of the plant by human intervention. many of our papers previously have been reflecting on some of the evolutionary aspects of molecular biology. Now we're talking about changing the molecular biology, changing the genetics of organisms. And here's a list of new techniques that are coming along and which are now being examined by the European Commission as to whether you could call these techniques transgenic, that is, transferring the gene by the methods that I just mentioned. So what is it that we seek to do when building into the seed these characteristics? Does this change result in a fundamentally altered responsibility to nature? Are we altering our role in the cosmos? And a couple of ethicists, Boat and Muller, put it, are we changing from manipulatio to creatio ex existendo? Bolton, they identify that there's a crucial distinction, using the abilities of nature through cultivation, manipulation, or even exploitation, differing from the reinvention of nature. So, what has been achieved so far? Well, at this point, I'd like to just switch over to a short video.
Genetically engineered crops in agriculture, a worldwide experiment on people, animals, and nature. Cultivation of genetically engineered crops like soy, maize, cotton, or canola have far-reaching consequences. 90% of genetically engineered crops belong to the corporate agricultural group Monsanto. The rest are owned by Syngenta, DuPont, Bayer, and others. Genetic manipulation of crops can have uncontrollable consequences. The function of genomes is only partially understood, but foreign genes are still introduced into crops. These genetically engineered crops are widely cultivated outdoors, where they cannot be controlled. Currently, 90% of GE cultivation occurs in the Americas, particularly in the USA, Argentina, Brazil, and Canada. It seems researchers have forgotten that genetically engineered crops once outside can no longer be controlled like they could in the lab. GE crops can self-replicate and pass on their new characteristics to neighboring crops, penetrating the fields of farmers who want to cultivate their crops without genetic engineering. Adverts from the genetic engineering lobby claim genetically engineered crops produce higher yields, but this marketing mantra is a complete hoax. It has been shown that crop yields for GE crops are no higher than normal crops, but farmers must buy more expensive patented genetically engineered seeds each year. This forces them to become dependent on corporate giants. But that's not all. Genetic engineering giants also produce pesticides and herbicides. There are two characteristic traits of genetically engineered crops. They are either resistant to herbicides, in which case the genetic engineering company itself produces the suitable herbicide, or the genetically engineered crop emits an insecticide. Whether or not the crops are resistant to weed killer or give off poisonous gases, not only weeds or pests are eliminated, other beneficial field growth and some living creatures are killed as well. But nature adapts, so pests and weeds develop resistance to pesticides. And that means that increasing amounts of stronger pesticides will be used. Especially grave consequences are observed in this respect in monocultures. For example, in South America, rainforests and other natural landscapes are destroyed every day to make room for genetically engineered monocultures and pasture. At the same time, the soil and groundwater are poisoned. On top of that, the genetic engineering lobby claims genetically engineered crops can help to reduce world hunger. Genetic engineering is not the answer. There is enough food on Earth. The problem is that it's not distributed fairly. But the fact is that most genetically engineered crops find their way into the livestock chain, so they end up as meat or dairy products in supermarkets. Along with all the destructive effects on the environment, one last awkward question remains. How do genetically engineered crops affect humans and animals? The answer is, no one knows. Therefore, it's important for you to carefully consider which products you buy. Get informed and get involved, because our world is not a testing ground. For more information about genetic engineering, go to greenpeace.org/GMO.
So there's one viewpoint. And the question that we now have to look at is just to examine some of those points and also look at what has happened and what we can say about the adoption of this genetic technique. So here's the global picture in terms of the figures. That is the value of the crops, the area that has been planted since 1996, that is now up at something like 150, 160 million hectares. So these are crops that have been adopted by farmers and there's been a cultivation surge, as you can see. What type of crops are these? They have genes in them which give herbicide tolerance, as the video showed, which means that they're resistant to herbicides that can be used to spray the crops, which kill all the weeds that would otherwise cause a lot of damage to the crop, but they survive. Or it can be insect resistance, as shown by this line here, or it can be a combination, and this is increasingly happening as molecular biologists and plant breeders become more skilled in the use of this technology. So what have the adoption rates been like? Well, for soybean, 81%, 93% in US, 99% in Argentina, 75% in Brazil. Cotton, 93% in US, 86% India, 69% China, maize, and so on, oilseed rape. Maize and soybean are interesting because when farmers in Brazil saw how successful these were in Argentina, they wanted to have this seed for their own use, of course. And so here's China's soy meal consumption, and China's plan to invest 3.5 billion in GM crops. And China is one of the world's largest importers of soybean. And it's now becoming increasingly difficult, actually, to obtain soya that is not derived from GM crops, as is the case with cotton. So these are the countries where adoption has been greatest. And you can see very little in Africa, very little in Russia, and nothing, virtually nothing in Europe and the UK. So we find that although there's been very significant uptake in certain places, it's interesting to note that developing countries grew approximately 50% of global biotech crops last year. People often think that this is something to do just with the rich countries, with the developed countries, but that's actually not true when you look at the figures. And they're expected to exceed industrial countries' land area devoted to GM crops by 2012. So 90% of farmers planting biotech crops worldwide are small resource farmers in developing countries. So the picture is an interesting one, and we now need to go on to consider what are the implications of this. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? And I think the cartoon makes quite an interesting point. I won't eat anything that's genetically modified, but it could be unhelpful, says the man with his bag of chips. So let's look at another viewpoint about this technology, this genetic technology, and whether it's actually going to be relevant and useful in the longer term, or whether it's something that we've all been hoodwinked into. Here's another viewpoint, and this one is actually from Europa Bio. Now, Europa Bio, I need to explain, is the representative in Europe of all the plant breeding companies. So this is an industrial viewpoint and shows a different perspective on this area.
Do you have enough food to eat every day? And water to cook, shower, and even water your flowers? You know that every choice you make has an effect on others around the world. But how much do you know about the effects of putting food on your plate? In Europe, we rely on other countries to grow a lot of our food. The developing world already devotes an area of farmland the same size as Germany to grow our food. But our land is already producing as much as it can, so we must import all this food to feed everyone, right? Actually, we don't have to. We're not growing as much as we could in Europe because we don't have access to some technologies. So we rely on Asia, South America, and Africa to meet our needs for food. It's great to support their economies, but we also use a lot of their natural resources. So, is there anything we could do in Europe to change this and become more self-sustaining? Actually, yes, we could increase the productivity of our existing land, and there is a way to grow more food on the same amount of land, and it even has environmental benefits. Too good to be true? The facts speak for themselves. With GM crops, 15 years of experience shows that 6 to 30% more food can be grown on the same amount of land. This means there's more land for wild plants and animals to flourish, too. Around 30% of food is lost before it can be harvested because it is eaten by pests. GM crops can help farmers target the pests before food is destroyed. They're good for the environment, too. In 2009, GM crops reduced global CO2 emissions by 17.7 billion kilograms. That's like taking more than 7 million of these off the road. But don't just take my word for it. 400 leading experts and stakeholders from the EU and 35 countries across the world agreed in the Foresight Report, The Future of Food and Farming, that there are real sustainable gains to be made by combining biotechnological, agronomic, and agroecological approaches. Leading scientists say it is very hard to see how it would be remotely sensible to justify not using new technologies, such as GM. And the World Health Organization has said GMOs offer the potential of increased productivity, improved nutritional values that can contribute directly to enhancing human health and development. By allowing access to safe technologies, such as the option of growing GM crops, Europe could feed itself better and take action to meet its responsibility to help produce enough food for the rest of the world. Good news for the 9 billion people who will live on planet Earth in 2050. For more information, visit seedfeedfood.eu.
So there's a sense in which one needs to say, who do you believe? And how do we assess? So let's move on now to the last part. How do we assess if modern genetics provides an appropriate intervention? The utilitarians will say that the moral worth of an action is determined only by its resulting outcome. Although there is debate how much consideration should be given to actual consequences. And it was Jeremy Bentham who wrote way back that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong, and that's described as a fundamental axiom. And it can be contrasted with what's often referred to as the deontological ethics, which does not regard the consequences of an act as a determinant of its moral worth, and virtue ethics, which primarily focus on acts and habits leading to happiness. So we need to consider if the genetics of molecular breeding has such utility. Does it have a benefit? And I think this is perhaps the best summary I've been able to find from a peer-reviewed work from PG Economics Limited, which is a think tank, independent, it's not industry funded. Pesticide reduction, carbon emission reduction, global farm income increase. So after 14 years of commercialization, it was concluded biotech crops have yielded a net increase in farm income while significantly reducing environmental impact. However, I think we have to be very careful to have a caveat here. This is not to say that GM crops are going to be the answer, the panacea for world hunger. That's totally unsafe extrapolation. There are some people who will make that assertion, but I think we have to be very careful about that point. So do the consumers really benefit? Is there a utility? Yield increases are societal benefits, environmental benefits are consumer benefits. Decreased sprayings, more efficient water use, less CO2, lower mycotoxins, and there are 3 products on their way. Healthier soya oils, trial plantings underway. This is to reduce the amount of saturated fat that we consume in our food. There's a late blight resistant potato that is being investigated, including trials in this country. And there's a drought tolerant maize, like this one here, which I saw a few months ago in Kenya, where here's the drought tolerant maize, which is a GM crop, whereas the non-drought tolerant maize, that is the normal maize crop, was dead, and it wasn't even worth filming. So here's an example of the way in which a crop is now underway, funded by Gates Foundation and private companies. It is a public-private activity. And there's a lot in the pipeline, of course. Here's an example of the soybean industry. This is an industry slide, and it shows what's happening in terms of transgenic GM crops that are on the way. These are ones that have resistance to pests and diseases. These are ones where there is a nutritional improvement in the quality of the product that has potentially a direct consumer benefit. So how do we assess if modern genetics provides an appropriate intervention? When we're faced with a new technology, the deontological and principle-based ethicists will also ask about important general principles such as respect for the autonomy of individuals, the beneficence of the action, is it beneficial, and the capacity for justice for the disadvantaged. Now, some believe in divine command theory, which states that an action is right if God has decreed that it is right. It's a form of deontology because the rightness of any action depends on the action being performed because it is a duty, not because of any good consequences arising from that action. And so perhaps the first video I showed is an example of those who regard it as a duty to prevent the development of this technology. But some deontologists are moral absolutists, believing that certain actions are absolutely right or wrong, regardless of the intention behind them, as well as the consequences. And Immanuel Kant argued that the only absolutely good thing is a good will. And so the single determining factor of whether an action is morally right is the will or motive of the person involved. So let's just look at this question of transparency and equity. In terms of transparency, food and feed safety risk assessment includes all these different things that have to be completed. Environmental risk assessment of any new crop arising from a new technology has to go through all these things here. And here's an example of the number of papers that have to be collected to submit to the European Food Standards Agency in order to have consideration of whether a crop is safe or not. So this is part of the transparency process that has been developed as far as the European Commission is concerned. Equity, how much money is going into the development of this to realise the benefits that I've been describing? And here's a list of the compliance costs for an insect resistance maize. The total figure is $7 to $15 million, range of costs incurred. So in this case, there's a risk assessment that is required, which many people feel needs to be harmonised across a whole range of countries, if possible internationally. And these are the various components of this risk assessment. And then there's extensive studies that have to be done, and these can go on for extremely long periods of time, actually. So it's, in terms of transparency and in terms of thoroughness, I think it's very difficult to raise fault so far as the authorities are concerned, who have responsibility of trying to establish whether this is safe. But are there downsides, or are there counterfactuals that we need to consider? Well, one of the potential downsides is that certain multinational companies appear to be trying to dominate the global food supply and the global plant breeding market. And there was a recent example of this which was reported in the Times a couple of weeks ago. GM cotton has been remarkably successful. Burkina Faso decided a few years ago that they would start to grow GM cotton, and from a zero position they're now almost at 90% acceptability, and it's had a significant effect in terms of the socio-economic aspects of that country. But in India, where GM cotton is also grown on a large scale, one of the states, India's second most populous state, Maharashtra, has recently banned the sale of genetically modified seeds in the latest blow against Monsanto, the US agribusiness giant, to try to block the further development of this technology. I think the situation is very reminiscent of that a few years ago, 10 years ago, when Monsanto, under public pressure, were forced to come out with the new Monsanto pledge, highly publicized. And it aimed to involve customers in decision-making in the use and stewardship of these new technologies, albeit belatedly. And corporate chief executive officers' behavior was labeled as tactically stupid, arrogant, and myopic in their record-setting introduction of a new technology. And interestingly, a number of their senior CEOs have acknowledged that. So there are complaints in Maharashtra that the seeds have not lived up to expectations, they've not given such a good product. Many farmers have been forced to scrape a living from small plots of land, and they've fallen deeper into debt because they have to pay for the seed. Now, there is another side to that story which I'll leave for discussion, but I want to use that as an illustration of a potential downside of this technology. There's another one which has to do with power politics. Europe has decided to adopt a precautionary principle with respect to GM, which states that if an action or policy has a suspected risk of causing harm to the public or to the environment, the burden of proof that it is not harmful falls on those taking the action. That's a very tough position to take, and very different from the approach that has been adopted elsewhere, which has been to emphasize the importance of risk assessment. And the effect of this is that many parts of Europe have no prospect of introducing the technology, even though, when asked, citizens in Europe, 77% of EU citizens were in favour of taking advantage of biotechnology in agriculture. It's been quite a shift over the last 5 years in the assessment. But there's another downside, which is perhaps even more troublesome, and that is the impact of Europe's policy position on Africa. And these are the countries where GM crops have been adopted, countries where they are beginning to do trials, but it's been of great interest to many students of this sort of area that African countries have been greatly influenced by their colonial past and the dictates of Brussels. But there's something wrong with it, according to what they say in Brussels. Therefore, there's doubt as to whether we should introduce it. Now, introducing this complex regulatory system in Europe has unintended consequences. And this is one of them, where it's now extremely difficult for a number of these countries to put in place the regulatory procedures, which will be very expensive. The complex European system makes the entire process of registration of new crops a lengthy and tedious process. Here's an example of the impact of regulation. 10 years ago, Ingus Petraikus in Switzerland had completed his work on golden rice. And here's a copy of a meeting that was held in 2008 at the Swedish Academy, in which a lot of that research was reviewed, and then there was a subsequent one in the Vatican where again the work was reviewed. Now, this is an example of where cumbersome regulatory regime has caused golden rice to be blocked in terms of its application. Golden rice has within it the means to increase intake of vitamin A and intake of iron, because it is biofortified. And in emerging economies, biofortified golden rice promises to save 500,000 children each year from blindness, the report says, and a total of over 1 million preventable deaths. So the scientific research was completed in 2000. We are still waiting for permission for it to be commercialized. It looks as if it may be commercialized next year, and the seeds will be made available free by the seed companies. A recent publication from the Pontifical Academy of Science, arising from a meeting on golden rice, quoted at the front the words of Jesus, "I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat." So the downside and counterfactuals are things that we need to consider, but what is it that we're actually doing? The question we set out with is whether the adoption of the new technologies to address food security issues are going to be beneficial, or whether there's going to be a downside. Are we playing God with this type of genetics? There's no explicit instruction in the Bible of any prohibition and prevention of the processes or the products of molecular breeding technologies, nor would we expect there to be. They were not invented at the time. Islamic scholars of modern biotechnology have also affirmed the acceptance of GM processes and products as long as the sources from which they originated were halal. Now, reservations about whether it is natural to use these genetic technologies to transfer genes across species boundaries is influenced and reflected in the views of Plato and Aristotle about eternal and ideal forms with a defining essence. So these ideas go back 2,000 years or so. It's deeply ingrained culturally, as we see in the arguments where there is a fixity of species, a topic that greatly interested Darwin. One of the ironies is that we seem relaxed about conventional breeding, which has been used for so long, which shuttles tens of thousands of genes with a little idea of the outcome before screening, whereas we are exercised about modern technologies that enable the movement of a single gene with confidence of the outcome. Ron Cole-Turner, professor of theology and ethics at Pittsburgh, ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, he writes about genetic engineering as provoking new insights into humans as co-creators with God, contributing to, rather than usurping, the divine work of creation through new technology. But Terry Eagleton, who you might imagine would have a different viewpoint, says, because God is transcendent, he needs us no more than a pet mongoose or a tattoo. He is therefore able to let us be. And quote Eagleton, and the word for this is freedom, which is where for Christian theology we belong to him most deeply. So to summarize on these typical ethical questions, is it safe? Questions of risk and risk assessment, notoriously hard to discuss rationally. But here's a long list of institutions that have looked at the evidence, and in fact there are quite a number beyond that point. Is it safe? Is it natural? The evidence is that humankind have been modifying plants by selection, seed collection for centuries, so that little that we grow today has any resemblance to its natural origins. Completely different. Is it fair? Well, there's a need to raise productivity, as we've seen, and this will lead to an expansion of breeding by the private and the public sector, many of whom are now working together, as well as novel forms of cooperation. Is it needed? Well, there's a maximizing food security requires that benefits outweigh the costs, and I think we've already seen that there are many arguments which one can bring forward to indicate the need for enhancing food production on the land that we have available. So GM technologies don't replace conventional plant breeding, but the fact that they are growing in terms of crop acreage means that today 1/5 of the world's population regularly eats food of GM origin or wears cotton of GM origin. Now I want to finish just in the last couple of minutes on a topic that I think was raised this morning, but it does take us to this aspect of pioneering technologies, and in particular Craig Venter's work on building living cells from scratch. And to summarize very briefly, the idea that you can synthesize by computer technology a long strand of DNA and put it into an organism which has never seen that length of DNA before, and create a completely different and new organism that has not been seen on the planet. Interestingly, synthetic biologists often refer to this work as intelligent design, small I, small d, as if they were the first generation of humans with the power to really change life, creatio ex existendo. You may remember Watson and Crick in that famous story about the way in which they burst into the eagle puff saying that we have found the secret of life. Well, not quite. But synthetic biologists, and synthetic biology is an emerging field which employs engineering principles for constructing genetic systems, and the approach is based on the use of well-characterized and reusable components and numerical models for the design of biological systems. Now, people with a faith position see in God the creator who encompasses supreme intelligence, wonder, and beauty. And the biblical writers understood the creativity in terms of diversity that can emerge and transformation that can take place. But I suppose it's the restlessness of the curiosity-driven scientists in laboratories like the laboratory of Craig Venter and some of the plant breeders that we've been thinking about, and Jim Hasloff in Cambridge, whose slide this is taken from, which reminded me of a poem that I heard recently, which goes way back to 1633, and I finish on this. It's the poem of George Herbert, which reminds us of the restlessness of scientists seeking to pursue truth. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, Let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches, which dispersed lie, contract into a span. So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honour, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made a stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasure, rest in the bottom lay. For if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature, so both should losers be. Yet let him, God, keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. Thank you very much.